On the bulletin board in my office is a sticker. I think it's been in almost every office I've had. It's still even on its backing paper, and it has this spiky green monster with yellow and black striped arms and a pretty nasty underbite. It is called the What If monster. He's from this picture book where he's the personification of Jonathan James's doubts. What if you fall? What if people laugh at you? What if no one likes your art? What if no one likes you? Eventually, though, Jonathan James gets fed up and asks some new and important questions, like, what if the what if monster is wrong? What if it all just works out? What if I follow my dream? The what if monster. I bet we all know this monster. I know that I'm pretty well acquainted with what has to be its mother, imposter syndrome. What if, right? This monster, though, it got me thinking about another monster, which I might call the if-only monster. It's a nightmare of regret and finger-pointing. If only. If only you had done this instead of that. If only you had made a different decision from the start. If only you had been there. If only. We can get so tied up in our if-onlys that we kind of languish there, endlessly blaming, constantly regretting. But in the face of this monster, the if-only monster, God always acts. Now, today's story begins with the first appearance in John's Gospel of Martha and her sister Mary. And before we get too far in, a planned digression. So, the story about Martha and Mary has been in the news recently. The oldest known papyri of John's Gospel has been fully digitized and uploaded to the internet for anyone to look at. And this section, the story of the rising of Lazarus, when you look at that papyri, it appears to show corrections, where letters have been carefully changed. A little iota, which is an I, gets changed to a theta. All the pronouns for Mary and Martha look like they were once singular and now they are plural. Before the corrections, it seems like the story is about Mary Magdalene and her brother Lazarus. But an editor has introduced these other early Christians, Mary and Martha, into the story. And the other important thing to note is that the early patristic letters, such as the letters of Tertullian, if you know who Tertullian is, I certainly don't, but back at this reading, that they also, when they talk about the raising of Lazarus, they only talk about one Mary. So it's all kind of interesting. Diana Butler Bass is the one who kind of brought this into the news, and you can read her explanation on her blog. You can Google it. The blog post is called Mary the Tower. And I think that this is actually significant because it fortifies a theory about Mary Magdalene being the apostle to the apostles, the one who shares the good news with the apostles. And a lot of evidence of her voice being systematically silenced by the patriarchs in the 2nd and 3rd century. But for our purposes today, whether it is one Mary who twice confesses, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died, and I know that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Or if these confessions end up shared by two faithful women who go on to fund the early church and also slay dragons, I don't know. I don't know that it matters to our reading of the story today. So I was thinking about what are, as we have read it, Martha's words, if only. Like, how did she say this? Like, what's the feeling behind this? Is she angry? Or is this, if only, a heart-sick confession, a regret that if things had worked out differently, well, they would have worked out differently? Anyone who has ever grieved knows that spiral. I felt so ignored by my doctor when my first pregnancy ended so abruptly and so tragically that I blamed her. I quite honestly cursed her name. If only she had done this or she'd done that, or I don't know, if only she just listened to me. And what I have learned in this is that there's very little that saves us from that kind of regret. In the end, little could have been done to change the trajectory for me. We will always wonder if things might have gone differently. Would they have gone differently? Could we have prevented tragedy, or at least prevented this unbelievable sadness? I've come to believe that the most common regret is also the most preventable. It's the failure to act. If only you had been here, my brother would not have died. It is possible, though, that Martha is just angry. She had, after all, sent word. She had told Jesus that Lazarus' health was going south. It isn't really like it's this kind of regret. It's like an accusation. If only you had been here, Jesus. And by golly, do we love that kind of if only. The if only that implies that somebody else ought to be feeling some regret. We love to lob them at one another, and especially at the poor. If only they had a job. If only they were more reliable. If only they'd refuse that narcotic prescription. Or if only this, or if only that. There's a million of these. Today in the Narthex, we're writing to Congress about the Farm Bill. And while the bulk of Bread for the World's lobby centers on benefits for people living in poverty, they are also lobbying for better farming practices and subsidies to encourage farmers of color. I think about all the if-onlys that get thrown at farmers without regard for the policies that continue to change farming, or the history that makes rural living difficult for farmers of color. If only in all of those situations hide the blame that says the hungry are responsible for their hunger, that farmers are responsible for the greater cost required for more sustainable agricultural practices and for the government policies that disincentivize them, that people of color are responsible for being driven out of farming by centuries of racist practices that made owning land and keeping its profits impossible for them. John's gospel has these beautiful vignettes of Jesus encountering people who are suffering, and perhaps more importantly, Jesus challenging all the pat answers that offer to explain their suffering. If only they'd been more faithful. Nope. If only they'd been more righteous. Wrong again. If only their parents or if only their community had been unstained by sin. Hard pass. Jesus refuses again and again, and even today, to condescend to our if-onlys, to our explanations of suffering and our faux laments of regret. We love the what-if that keeps us from acting, and the if-only that keeps us from shouldering responsibility. We say, if only, and God says, watch this. The onlookers point out to Jesus that surely the one who can make the blind see could have healed Lazarus, if only. And Jesus says, watch this, and raises Lazarus from the grave. And beloved, today, you can hear those if-onlys that our society rubs in the faces of the poor and the rural and the farmer and the person of color. You can hear them, you can witness them, and then watch this. I love this little saying from Dag Hammarskjöld's journal, published under the title Markings. He writes, "You wake from dreams of doom, and for a moment you know, beyond all the noise and all the gestures, the only real thing, love's calm, unwavering flame and the half-light of an early dawn. All the doom and regret, all the if-onlys, and love says, watch this." And you see in that moment, love changes the if-onlys into confession, the accusing regrets into statements of faith. In the face of all the if-onlys of this world is the belief that when love gets her hands on the world, it is forever changed and whole and healed and alive. Amen.